So, yeah. So before I begin, there is a basic overall point to the book, which I think makes it different from other books. And that is that it is a feminist revision in the sense that instead of thinking of Jung in a patriarchal way as a father figure who has a series of fixed meanings in his psychology, that we can think a totally different way, that there are many Jungs. Some of them are within the collected works. Some of them are the women he worked with. And there are many Jungs. This idea is not something that I'm imposing upon Jung. It is actually an idea that is within Jungian psychology itself. So in one sense, it's quite a radical book in proposing this change of perspective, a feminist perspective on Jung. And on the other hand, it's actually, I would argue, very true to something important in his work. So let's proceed. And okay, yep. Okay. So this is what I've said, that within the collected works there are several Jungs. Making visible the multiple voices in Jung's writing means that we can welcome Jung, the unlikely feminist, as well as the Jung who prefers patriarchal binaries, and even Jung, the ghost, playing tricks. All three of Susan's topics for the talk are to be found in the newly translated Jung, a Feminist Revision. They are firstly the many Jungs and how they play off and conflict with each other. Secondly, there are many Jungians, such as the neglected pioneering women who worked with Jung. Their work on gender deserves being seen as central, not marginal. Thirdly, we in the 21st century have the chance to dream the myth onward. For example, Jung's feminist-friendly symbolic order is available to diagnose the problem of the phallic anima. Ultimately, such work can bear fruit in a distinctly feminine research methodology that I proposed in my 2021 book with Joel Weishaus. So here we go. Why feminism? Why do we care about feminism today? Well, we care because it's still there is still a very powerful patriarchy that treats women and men differently. And of course, this is different in different countries, but across the world, women are not equal, and feminine values are not as valued as they should be, not least because we need more of the feminine if we are to address 21st century crises. For example, the climate emergency is arguably the result of patriarchy and capitalism. So there is the question of patriarchy. There is also the question that there is unconsciousness in the collective. So on the one hand, we live in a world that plays lip service to equality, treating women equally, at the same time as women's rights, autonomy over their bodies are being eroded. There is the continued suffering that is caused by patriarchy. There is even what has been called a resurgent fascism that fuses with toxic masculinity. And I'm happy to talk more about any of these if anyone wants to ask a question later. Was Jung a feminist? Well, not exactly. But he did pay attention to what has been left out of the Christian Trinity. And he said what has been left out has been the feminine and evil. So there is this sense in Jung that there is a feminine that is needed to save modernity. So I would argue that there is a very deep feminist drive in Jung's work, because what has been cut out of modernity to create it as something that claims to believe in rationality, what has been cut out is often in the form of the feminine, and therefore the feminine must be recovered to save us, because Jung did see his work as responding to an existential crisis in the modern world. Jung also was perceptive in understanding that what is unconscious in us as individuals, what is unconscious in us as a society, that it is a challenge to the status quo. And I'll say more about this later when I talk about Jung's feminist symbolic order. So Jung isn't a feminist in a straightforward sense, even if he has that deep feminist drive, because he is essentialist on women and men, meaning that he thought that women and men were born feminine and masculine, that a woman by her nature cannot and should not live what he would call a man's life, and a man by his nature should not be living a woman's life. He did not see that men could be the chief nurturers in a family, for example, and that women could find their destiny in working in the world. In that sense, he's definitely not a feminist, because he believes in a kind of fixed nature that means that women should lead a certain kind of traditional life that is not about them having equal opportunities in the world. And part of his not being a feminist is that there is a structure here of a binary, and he follows German philosophy in believing in a binary system, that if men were one way, then women would be the opposite way, and vice versa. So he feels very strongly that things work through opposites, and we can see that in his description of individuation as opposites in the psyche coming more into a relationship. So on the one hand, men and women should stay in their traditional roles. And on the other hand, he is saying that the feminine needs to be brought back into modernity. This is a conflict, but he kind of sorts it out in his own mind, because bringing the feminine back is actually bringing the feminine back for men. The feminine must be restored or re-storied in individuation to build up the psychological strength of men. And in this form, that is the work of the anima. It is not, to Jung, that the feminine must come back in a kind of liberation for women. The role of women is to stay where they are, not to be bringing the feminine into modernity. So it's a real kind of tension in Jung, I think, over this question of gender, between We need the feminine in the form of the anima, but it's for men, it's not for women. And he also uses the anima to denigrate women. He often shows a kind of fear of the power of his own anima, and then on the other hand, perhaps to deal with the fear, characterizes her as inferior, as nagging, and there is a tendency to let that spill over into comments about women that he doesn't justify. And yet, we have the Jung that gives us the idea of individuation. And individuation means gender should be fluid and relational. Individuation means that men should temper their innate masculinity with the feminine values that can come via the anima. For women, individuation means that their innate femininity should be developed by a relationship with masculinity as the animus. But there is a but there, and we will see that in a minute. However, Jung also says several times in different ways in the collected works that theory is a model, not an absolute. He talks about building a model that others might like to use rather than asserting absolute truths about the psyche. And that's something we often forget about Jung, that within the Jung who brings all these ideas, there is the Jung who says, well, I am to a certain extent speculating from my experiences and my patients, but this is not necessarily the absolute truth for all time. And these many voices that I've touched on already in the collected works, these different emphases, these conflicts, these are not only necessary but fundamental, that the psyche is not one thing. If it was, there would be no unconscious. That the idea of archetypes means that there are different. Okay. Okay. And therefore, that Jungian psychology has a decentering and decolonizing drive because of its fostering, of its developing of multiplicity. And you can see here this image of the hermaphrodite, which kind of sums up some of this tension and multiplicity in Jung, that these so-called opposites need to come together as they do in alchemy. So here we have humans and nature, we have sky and earth, we have masculine and feminine, we have sun and moon. So the talk has these three directions: that there are many Jungs, that there are neglected female Jungians of the first generation, and that there is something that we can actually use and become very creative with in Jung, a Jungian symbolic, a Jungian sense of how the psyche works can become a feminist-friendly sense of how the psyche works. So this is a quote I've used a lot. It's certainly in the book, and it's one of Jung's kind of remarkable statements, which I'm going to read. The anima has an erotic emotional character, the animus a rationalizing one. Hence, most of what men say about feminine eroticisms, and particularly about the emotional life of women, is derived from their own anima projections and distorted accordingly. On the other hand, the astonishing assumptions and fantasies that women make about men come from the activity of the animus, who produces an inexhaustible supply of illogical arguments and false explanations. Now, in the one sense, this is actually very funny, and very often people just laugh out loud when I read this. It's funny because it's not even-handed. It begins in a sort of very kind of rational way. The anima has this, the animus is that. And then the second sentence, it makes a lot of sense in saying that men cannot be, wholly rational and objective about women because they have their own anima projections. And then we have the third and kind of somewhat crazy over the top sentence about women having inexhaustible supply of illogical arguments and false explanations. And you could see it as an example of Jung taking the anima and the animus and just kind of allowing his ideas of how they work to over-influence and make a very general and unfair comment about women. However, there is another way, there is another thing going on here, because if we really delve into these three sentences, the figure that speaks the third sentence is not the same voice as the first and the second. Because if we take seriously, hence most of what men say about feminine eroticism is derived from their own anima projections, then that third sentence is the voice of the anima. It is the anima saying that women are incredibly irrational because of the activity of the animus. Now, we don't know whether this is Jung playing a trick, setting a trap for the reader. Will they spot that I'm actually giving an example of what I've just said? Or is he not playing a trick and the anima has just come out of his psyche and taken over his pen and, done its own thing without him being fully aware of what's happening? We have no way of deciding what is going on here, but we can see a number of different possibilities. And this undecidability is really rather exciting. And the notion that this could be a trick and this could be an example of the distortion that men might take about women, and that this is a kind of feminist idea that we can see the work of gender actually happening in this. So let's take two ideas about the anima that we find from elsewhere in the collected works. So he says this, thus the insinuations of the anima, the mouthpiece of the unconscious, can utterly destroy a man. There's a real sense of power and fear here. And yet he also says, psychologically, the self is a union of conscious masculine and unconscious feminine. It stands for the psychic totality. This is a much calmer voice, someone who is in control of what they're saying, who is expressing something very clearly in a very balanced way. So these different voices are within Jung's work. Does it matter if there are many Jungs? Well, I think it's a good thing if there are many Jungs. Because what we normally do with that quotation I just showed you is we smooth it out. We knock off the bits that are disruptive to a fixed conscious meaning, and we forget about them, and we just take what we can get as a sort of clear, rational idea. That is the way we are often taught to read Jung. It is a very patriarchal way of reading Jung because it creates Jung as the perfect father who has perfect consciousness, who never loses control. It is deifying Jung, and it is dehumanizing Jung. So if we do that, if we read for the one set of meanings, the patriarchal set of meanings, reading for one Jung means losing the flow, the performative quality of the writing. In my view, the collected works are a treatment, a performance of the psyche designed to treat the reader, not to tell the reader what is the absolute truth. And if we don't read for one, it means that we are allowing the decentering energy in the writing to enact a dialogue between eros, which Jung calls feminine values, and logos, which he calls masculine values. In my book, Jung, a Feminist Revision, I call this a dialogue in Jung's writing between personal myth, that's the sort of decentering energy, and grand theory, that is the energy that produces these very clear ideas. So that quote about the anima destroying a man, that is personal myth. Grand theory is the anima is this, and the animus is that. So reading for one is anti-feminist because it's collaborating with patriarchy. And when we read for one, it's typically, what does Jung really mean by this? You know, there is that quotation, it's a bit odd, it's not quite rational. So what does Jung really mean by this? Let's make it a rational idea. It's also asking for the ego. When we make Jung more rational than Jung's writing actually is, we are prioritizing the ego. And we are asking for the ego to be perfect, absolute consciousness, perfect meaning. And we are treating the ego as a god. It is a monotheistic reading practice to say, what does Jung really mean by this? And we don't actually really mean the man, who probably would have an argument with us if he was around. We actually are imagining some perfect source of truth. It is not Jungian. It is not Jungian to create a Jung of perfect rational truth, because it's not individuating. It is anti-individuation. It leaves no room for symbols. It represses the other. So I've moved rather quickly here, but that is my presentation on the many Jungs and why there is that feminist energy within the collected works. I just want to mention a couple of Jungians whom we tend not to read today, or at least not read as people who should be considered as extremely important in developing ideas. Recently, myself and a few wonderful Brazilian analysts reread Emma Jung on the anima and animus, and it was extraordinary to see how she tries really hard to stay within the boundary of Jung's setting out the anima and animus, and yet it writes in a very transformative way and a very positive way. She makes the animus a very positive thing for women, which Jung, of course, did not. And her notion that women in their individuation should be integrating the animus as power, deed, word, and meaning is extraordinarily powerful, I think. And she talks about women developing their own autonomy. Really, really important stuff. It just so happens that Emma Jung's writings, her unpublished writings, her art, her essays, her dreams, these are about to be published. I know this because I was asked to write a blurb for the book. So I'm really glad that we're going to see more of her work. Linda Davis, in her book, Women's Dionysian Initiation, does wonderful things with the animus, because she's using the mysteries from Pompeii, these paintings, these wall paintings that were discovered in Pompeii, as a way of understanding how women might have been initiated, how women might have developed a positive relationship to masculinity within themselves and outside themselves. And it's a very inspiring book. Esther Harding, also a contemporary with Jung who had a number of very strong arguments with him, we hear. And her books are an attempt really to find a territory outside patriarchy for women to find their fulfillment. And this really brings me to another theme in the book, that female Jungians of the first and second generation very often wanted to move outside of the Christian religious structure to find a space for the feminine to fully be represented, to fully be itself. So you have the development of work on what was called the feminine principle, and the development of work looking at goddesses, usually goddesses from the Greco-Roman pantheon, that as ways of showing women and the feminine as powerful and extraordinary and capable of so much more. So arguably, Jung's anima animus amounts to a masculine principle, and the female Jungians produce a feminine principle that requires a territory outside patriarchy. So they go to goddesses and the myths of other cultures. A further development occurs with archetypal psychology, which was developed by James Hillman and his contemporaries. And of course, as you will know, archetypal psychology moves away from Jung's fascination with the Christian notion of the divine, and Jung's struggle with the idea of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and how he wanted to add a fourth, and how Jung felt that in some senses, the Virgin Mary was the fourth, in some senses, Satan was the fourth. And so he struggles to bring the feminine back here. And whereas James Hillman and his contemporaries want to imagine the psyche as much more polytheistic, and that there would be many archetypes without one dominating. There wouldn't be a Christian God that would equate to the self. Rather, the self is made up of all these different goddesses and gods. So you have figures, important figures here like Christine Downing and Jeanette Paris, who've done wonderful work on archetypal psychology. But we need to kind of get beyond the notion that we can think of archetypal psychology as Greco-Roman. So just as archetypal psychology expands the archetypal pantheon from monotheism, from Christianity, so today's feminists and analytical psychologies are called to expand the mythic vision of the psyche beyond the Greco-Roman. Basically, every culture has its own way of doing archetypes. Usually, one of the main ways that a culture does its archetypes is in its religious system. So a very different culture from a Western culture that's had that influence of ancient Greece and Rome, a very different culture will have its archetypes in a very different mythology. And today we are looking at different mythologies to see how different cultures do their archetypes, and they do them in ways that might be liberating for us to see, not least when it comes to gender and sexuality. This is transdisciplinary. So part of a feminist vision, I think, today is to see not only Jung's notion of the psyche having within it this decentering, but that we can decenter assumptions of colonial superiority. We can decolonize ideas of psychology. We can decolonize ideas of knowledge. And transdisciplinarity is, I would argue, anticipated in Jung's decentering multiple voices. So to come to the symbolic order, what is the symbolic order? Well, the symbolic order is usually associated with Freudian or Lacanian psychology. The psychology of Jacques Lacan builds on Sigmund Freud's ideas of the Oedipus complex. And the symbolic order is, Lacan argued, the symbols that organize power in any society. And to Lacan, that's the symbol of power was the phallus, which was not the penis itself, but the penis as the sign of power. So the phallus is the sign of power. And in patriarchy, that phallus dominates power, and therefore it dominates meaning. And so the relationship that you or your activity has to meaning is organized around a relationship to a phallus symbol. So with Freud, it all begins with the penis. With Lacan, it is the phallus as the sign of the penis. And its singleness relates to Judeo-Christian monotheism. But with Jung, it's not quite the same, because although Jung with the anima and animus tries to stay within the monotheistic frame, he tries to kind of use Christianity as a framework for meaning. However, it isn't necessarily the case, because for Jung, the penis is not a decisive factor in creating the psyche. It can be a powerful factor. Jung did not deny that for some people, the Oedipus complex was very important, very powerful, but he did deny that the Oedipus complex and sexuality was the only way, the important way for everybody. So for Jung, the phallus cannot be a kind of defining symbol. Rather, the psyche is given birth to by the collective unconscious. For Jung, the unconscious is not just something that is created when the child begins to develop consciousness, but for Jung, the unconscious is also a chalice, a cauldron of potential development, potential meaning. The cauldron is the collective unconscious, and it contains archetypes. We don't know how many, and these archetypes have all this built-in potential. They are seeds, and they are generative, and they help to generate the psyche. This means that the Jungian symbolic order doesn't have a defining symbol. Yes, there is patriarchy, and patriarchy has defining symbols, but in a Jungian symbolic order, they are not necessary. It would be possible to have a totally different symbolic order. Basically, Jungian psychology says patriarchy exists, but it doesn't have to exist. We can imagine something entirely different. So the Jungian symbolic order is liberatory because it challenges existing power symbols. For individuation to exist and for cultural change to exist, it must be that the energies of the unconscious, in Jung's view, challenge the status quo, challenge conventionality. You know, when we individuate, we stop taking for granted what society is telling us and start thinking for ourselves and acting for ourselves. That is a subversive thing to do, and it may be a feminist thing to do. So the Jungian symbolic order challenges existing power symbols because his archetypal unconscious is generative. So ultimately, Jung's generative symbolic order is what transdisciplinarity calls tradition. So Jung's generative symbolic order, and transdisciplinarity isn't in the book because it's something that I discovered after writing the book. But this discussion of the Jungian symbolic order is in the book. And transdisciplinarity is a new way of looking at knowledge that includes all the knowledges that have been excluded. And it uses the name tradition to signify all those excluded knowledges. And Jung's generative symbolic order is feminist friendly because it is holistic, inclusive, and decolonizing. I've put my latest novel here because what I'm doing now in my Jungian work is to use the Jungian symbolic order. So Murder on family grounds. My novels are murder mysteries where the detective figure is actually based on the triple goddess. So rather than the fictional detective being based on male models and being based on the phallic hero, I'm basing my powerful, meaning-making figure in the story, in the fiction, on the triple goddess. And I'm using the triple goddess, the maiden, the matron, and the crone, to look at the ways in which women have been marginalized, and then I'm bringing them back to power by using a Jungian symbolic of the triple goddess. I will not go on about that. I will simply show you a picture of the book and bring this to a conclusion. So the book here, Jung, a Feminist Revision, decenters Jung's patriarchal voice in favor of a network of voices that includes the women that he worked with. It introduces some neglected voices. There are a number of women's work that I introduce in the book. And it argues for the opportunity of Jung's symbolic versus the phallic one of Freud. It suggests that a feminist lens sees Jung as Gothic and literary. And that is my talk. Which means we have some time for questions or just comments. I'd love to hear from some of you. So there are many, many, many messages, which is great, but I don't have time to, I mean, it's going to take me a while to read them. Someone has, and I can't actually read them because they're moving too quickly, but somebody has asked about whether the fear of his mother would be significant. And I think that's very true. I think the fear of his mother is very significant. And you know, it's quite important to think about Jung the man as opposed to Jung the father of psychology. And that's one way of decentering this idea that we have all these concepts that we have to just accept. Yeah. And you know, to be fair on Jung, as I've been saying, this not making Jung the father is within the writing itself. So thank you, Marcella. So Roberta has a hand up. Would you like to unmute and say your question, Roberta?
Olá, tudo bom, Susan? Eu agradeço por você ser uma voz feminina, falando aqui em nome de todas nós, mulheres, o quanto que isso é importante no mundo, que há tanto tempo vem sendo regido pelo patriarcado e com toda uma lógica sendo construída por homens. E a importância que é as mulheres poderem falar dentro da realidade que elas sabem e que somente elas vão conseguir construir a partir da própria realidade. Então, assim, mais importante do que o Jung falou da gente é a gente saber e construir essa identidade de quem nós somos. E a partir disso, dessa construção e dessa troca entre as mulheres, a gente sim poder fazer uma releitura sobre o que Jung falou e se apropriando disso para a gente, dentro da nossa realidade. Sim, ele não era Deus. Ninguém vai saber mais sobre as mulheres do que as próprias mulheres, e a gente precisa exercitar esse lugar de voz, de estar nos lugares, inclusive dentro, né, dentro dos espaços da psicologia, foi construída inicialmente por teorias feitas por homens, né, dentro dos congressos junguianos. É um chamado mesmo que eu faço para todas as mulheres, para que a gente possa falar, quebrar um silêncio que nos foi imposto por tanto tempo e que a gente ainda reproduz de maneira inconsciente, né? Então, acho que é mais produtivo a gente se apropriar dessa teoria a partir do nosso ponto de vista agora, desse contexto de época que nós estamos agora, dentro dessas vozes femininas que vêm se levantando pelo mundo, e a partir disso a gente construir, sim, essa leitura feminista dessa teoria tão grandiosa de Jung, aonde, sim, você tem toda a razão. Ele traz ali o que foi possível para ele ver e ele enxergar e ele reproduzir isso no contexto de época dele. E ele sempre deixou para a gente, de uma maneira muito gentil, essa abertura, tipo, olha, eu vi até aqui. Agora vocês me dizem o que vocês veem, o que vocês enxergam. E isso já foi para um contexto de época que ele vivenciou, enfim, um trabalho grandioso que ele já fez para a humanidade. E agora é com a gente e com nós mulheres. Então, vamos lá, vamos conversar sobre isso. Já comprei seu livro e a maneira como você construiu hoje, principalmente esse centramento da psicologia, que inicia com a teoria freudiana e com toda essa construção em torno do pênis, já deu, né? Tá velho, tá antigo, e a gente fica aqui muitas vezes falando e refalando disso. E vamos embora, mulherada, que a gente tem muito ainda que dizer aí pelo mundo afora. Obrigada, Susan.
Well,
Thank you, Roberta. Thank you. That's wonderful. And you're right. You're right. I mean, you know, my point has always been multiplicity. And if what it would be great if the book just gets you all going, lets your voices come out, because that's what we need. We need to value all the voices that have not been heard. Thank you so much, Luciana. And I want to thank my wonderful interpreter and Mateus and everybody who's made today possible. It's a great honor for me, and I'm very delighted and happy and honored by this wonderful institution and the work that you do.